So this is a topic that it's near and dear to my heart. I'm actually getting ready to go present to a few hundred doctors in April on the very topic of leaky brain. It's one of those that, leaky. It's kind of like leaky gut gets all the press, right? And leaky brain just kind of the redheaded stepchild on the sideline that doesn't really get the notoriety that it deserves. But when you think of leaky brain, I want you to think of things like Alzheimer's disease, dementia. I want you to think of, just in general, before even dementia, something so severe as dementia sets in, I want you to think along the lines of cognitive decline. So maybe you go to the kitchen, you don't remember what you were going to do. Maybe you have brain fog. Maybe you have poor recall, and you don't remember things that you used to could remember. These types of symptoms can be linked to leaky brain or brain inflammation. And so there are other diseases directly linked to leaky brain as well. And some of those are gluten-related diseases. So a perfect example here might be something like epilepsy, seizure disorder, cerebellar ataxia. For any of you that get dizzy and don't have an explanation as to why, you're not drinking alcohol, but you lose your balance very easy, that there is an autoimmune leaky brain type of situation called cerebellar ataxia that can occur. There are other conditions that result as a result of a leaky brain. And some of those, again, are neurological in nature in terms of neurological inflammation. Think of leaky brain as an entity that occurs. First, we have leaky gut. Secondarily, we have inflammatory proteins and other things that are entering the bloodstream that can then damage the blood-brain barrier or break the blood-brain barrier down. So now proteins and other elements are able to get at and get into the brain and create an inflammatory response, creating brain tissue. So hormone dysfunction or hormone disorders, remember, part of what your brain does, there's an area of the brain called the pituitary gland, and it regulates. It's a producer of many of our master regulatory hormones. Some of these hormones, like follicle stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. We've also got thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Again, these are just examples of hormones that regulate lots of other hormones in the body. And if you've got an inflammatory process where chemicals are getting access to the brain that wouldn't otherwise have it because of an intact blood-brain barrier, you can end up with a major problem in your hormone function. And we see this oftentimes. Some people will start to develop, women particularly, abnormal menstrual cycles. We'll see thyroid dysfunction as a result of leaky brain. So I want you to think of leaky brain not as necessarily a disease so much as it is a process that can occur beyond the leaky gut. So a lot of people are taking glutamine and aloe, and they're doing things to try to seal and heal their leaky gut, taking supplements or changing their diet accordingly. But there's a subtly different approach to addressing a leaky brain type of scenario. So there are a few things I wanted to go through tonight, because some of those you may not be doing. Some of those things are not diet related. So let's see here. Tara from New York is chiming in. Barbara's chiming in. Let's see. It's like we have some people are asking already the question, and those of you who have questions, make sure that you go ahead and punch them in. We'll get them answered hopefully before the night's over. And so is that inflammation of the brain is viral? I'm going to assume what you mean, Barbara, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are you asking me if inflammation of the brain can actually be viral? Yeah, it absolutely can be. Viruses can be one of the triggers for what I like to call brain inflammation, right? Inflammation of the brain. So yeah, there are a number of different viruses that are known to have a great affinity for neural tissue. Herpes simplex virus is one of them, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the sexually transmitted kind. If you've heard of shingles or varicella zoster, these are just nicknames or other terms for the herpes virus, the non-sexually transmitted form that loves your neuronal tissue. It likes to hang out in nervous tissue. And when it gets activated, it can create a lot of neural inflammation. Anyone who's ever had shingles, it's not necessarily shingles. They're not necessarily in the brain per se, but some people will get shingles along the head, along the face in a neurological pattern or in a neurotome pattern. Some people will get it along the spine, and it can be extremely painful, excruciatingly painful, as a matter of fact, just depending on how aggressive the lesions come out and play. But people who are at risk for these types of viral, dysfunctional, viral eruptions, that can damage neurological tissue, these are the ones that generally we would say they're immunosuppressed or immunocompromised. Not necessarily that their immune system is being suppressed, but oftentimes it can be something that the immune system is being overwhelmed and it doesn't have the resources to continue to fight the environment plus the food plus other things that it has to fight on a regular daily basis. So when we pick up a virus or we pick up an infectious load, it's kind of the straw, the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will, and it can set off a chain reaction of the virus having the capacity to replicate and kind of grow out of control and create an inflammatory response along the nerve tissue. So to answer your question, yes, it absolutely can be viral, and oftentimes it is, but it doesn't have to be. Somebody else is chiming in on cause, question mark, like what is the cause of leaky brain? Some of the biggest causes that I've seen associated with problems within the brain actually are medications, meaning people taking medications chronically for too long. Certain medications can definitely have an impact or an effect. And some of those are blood pressure medications. There's some research now coming out on how certain blood pressure medications can affect the barrier function, epithelial barrier function. Remember that you have different barriers within our body, and one of those barriers is the gut barrier, right? It's this intestinal lining inside of the GI tract. But one of those barriers is also the blood-brain barrier, and so again, it can be compromised. There are a number of different triggers. Infection can be one. Viral, bacterial is another version of infection that can trigger this type of problem. But we can also have problems within the gut that stimulate neurological changes within the brain, making the brain more leaky. And this doesn't even have to happen as a result of a leaky gut. This can happen as a result of abnormal bacteria living within the gut. Remember, I talked a little bit about this last week. About 60% of your dopamine is produced by the bacteria that harbor your gut, that live in your gut, and about 90% of the serotonin is produced as a result of healthy bacteria within your gut. And these neurotransmitters have direct access to your brain through your vagus nerve. So your vagus nerve is a communication highway between your gut and your brain. And so, if the message coming through the vagus nerve is not necessarily conducive to a healthy blood-brain barrier, then we can actually stimulate brain permeability as a result. And if those of you who have read No Grain, No Pain, you'll remember I wrote about the gut-brain connection, and that very, very important to understand, because again, you may have a leaky gut that is causing or triggering a leaky brain per se, but you may not. You may not have a leaky gut, but you can still have a leaky brain. Another question, simple question here: can brain inflammation be caused by parasites? Yeah, it can. There have been some very, very strange documented parasites getting into neurological tissue, potentially getting into the brain. So it can, but it's just in my experience anyway, it's a less common scenario. Let's see here. Can leaky brain affect your memory? Well, that's part of one of the symptoms of how you would really identify it. Let's talk about those symptoms again for a leaky brain. One of the symptoms can actually be poor memory or cognitive decline. We don't remember as well. We can't recall as well. We fumble for words when we're trying to talk in sentences. We have to dig around in the back of our head trying to think of what the word is. We may know what it is, but it's hard to bring that word to our lips. That can be a symptom. Other symptoms include epilepsy is actually a disorder that oftentimes is present with a leaky blood-brain barrier. Cerebellar ataxia, which I mentioned earlier, which is a state where people can develop dizziness. Migraine headache is another condition that we'll oftentimes see associated with a leaky brain. So if you're a headache sufferer or migraineur, then you might want to consider this as a potential part of your problem. Other things that we sometimes see, one of the big triggers that I see. So I was mentioning infection, and a lot of people think of infection, they think of like a cold or a flu or a virus, but sometimes what can happen is you can get an infection in the nose and the deep sinus cavities, and there are a number of different varieties from fungal to bacterial. These are some of the more common types, but I've seen people with mold growth in their deep sinus cavities. Remember, mold can release mycotoxins that can stir up chronic inflammation. If you've ever heard the term CIRS, CIRS, it stands for chronic inflammatory response syndrome. This is a type of condition that can oftentimes be triggered as a result of an exposure in this deep sinus cavities from a mold or a yeast overgrowth or a bacterial overgrowth. These infectious microorganisms can produce toxins that can penetrate up through the nose into, remember, your nose is an extension of your brain. So it's one of those things that definitely can be a contributing factor. So if you suffer, for example, these are other symptoms that can be linked to a leaky brain. If you suffer at night with snoring, a lot of snoring because your nose is chronically congested or clogged, if you have a lot of sinus pressure going across, no matter what you do, some people will get sinus pressure. And I'm not saying that everyone with sinus pressure has a leaky brain, but some people will get sinus pressure as a result of seasonal allergies. They may be allergic to the ragweed or the pollen or whatever it might be. And so they get more sinus pressure because they're generating more mucus in their sinus cavities. But if you struggle with it all the time and it never goes away, and your spouse is always nudging you because you're snoring because of that congestion, that's a very strong possibility that you might have one of these. And especially if it's coupled with brain fog, poor memory, poor word recall, those types of things. So again, another symptom that I should mention, because it's very, very common, is depression. Depression can be a symptom of inflammation within the brain. And there are a lot of different reasons why people can suffer from depression, but brain inflammation is one of them. It's caused by a leaky brain, a permeable blood-brain barrier, allowing things to come in to the brain that don't belong, creating an inflammatory response and altering the way neurotransmitters are produced. And again, that's a possibility as well. So a lot of different things that can be a trigger. And let's see, I want to make sure I get to some of these other questions. So Barbara is asking about Crohn's. I'm going to assume, Barbara, that you're asking, can Crohn's be a trigger? Well, Crohn's is a chronic autoimmune inflammatory disease of the large intestine. Generally, it's the right side of the large intestine, Crohn's is. And with that being the case, that Crohn's inflammatory bowel disorders are coupled with leaky gut, which again can translate into the progression of a leaky brain. So to answer your question, yes, Crohn's can create that. Now, I'm listing different symptoms for you just because many of you, maybe you've already changed your diet and you're still struggling with memory or cognitive issues or neurological issues that could be linked to a leaky brain. And so your diet has already changed to accommodate your health, but you haven't done some of the other things that can be important. Some of the things that happen that can propel, once leaky brain is there, if it's an inflammatory condition, there are certain things that you would want to do that might be helpful for modulating inflammation. And one of the most effective ways to modulate a healthy inflammatory response is omega-3 fatty acids. Now, I can't overemphasize these enough. When I test for people who come to see me in the office, we'll do omega-3 testing. And almost 100% of the time, when I first see somebody, their omega-3s are so low, they're almost non-existent. Now, remember that omega-3, DHA is a type of omega-3, and it comprises a ton of your brain tissue. So a lot of your brain tissue actually is DHA. It's made from DHA. So if you don't have adequate quantities of DHA, docosahexaenoic acid is what that is, DHA. It's a type of omega-3 fatty acid. Then you can start to develop a hyperinflammatory response in your brain tissue. And it also is linked to low IQ. It's linked to poor memory. It's linked to cognitive decline. As a matter of fact, years ago, this DHA was mandated that it be added to baby formulas because, there were years where baby formulas were not putting omega-3, and doctors were telling moms, do baby formula because it's better than your breast milk, but there was no omega-3 in baby formula. And so we were having babies being born mentally retarded with all kinds of health issues because they weren't getting the essential omega-3 fatty acids. So You got to keep, this is a nutrient you've got to keep at the top of the list. If you don't eat a lot of fish, a lot of cold water fish like salmon and cod and halibut and mackerel and anchovy and sardines and tuna, then you're probably not getting enough omega-3 in your diet. Now, you can get some omega-3 from grass-fed beef, but it's generally not as rich as the fish. You can also get some plant-based omega-3 in flax and chia, but they're not technically EPA and DHA. Your body has to deal with that type of omega-3 and do the conversion to EPA and DHA. So they're not as readily accessible for a lot of people who have been struggling with chronic malnutrition. The other source, one of the other sources for omega-3 in the diet, some people will say algae. I don't recommend that as a source. I've tried it both ways, using algae-based forms and using fish-based forms, and hands down, fish-based forms of omega-3 are far, far superior in terms of absorption and in terms of the ability to get your omega-3 status elevated to what it needs to be to create a healthy inflammatory response, and that includes in your brain and to give you the brain support. So omega-3, again, a huge, huge factor. I wouldn't, if you're not using an omega-3 supplement, for this, it's something I would highly, highly recommend that you look at. Of course, the omega-3 brand that I recommend, because I can verify that it's free of toxins, including mercury, is a product called Omega Max. Omega Max is it's a superior pharmaceutical grade omega-3 based product. Here, I'll put a link in for those of you who don't have a source. The other thing you've got to be aware of with omega-3s is one of the issues with them is a lot of products that are out there, the dosing is marginal. It's really, so like you might buy a product and the dosing on the omega-3, you might get a couple 100 milligrams of EPA and DHA in a big horse pill, a 1 gram omega-3 horse pill. It's not going to cut it. It's just not strong enough. You've really got to push, a full gram of EPA and DHA just to get anywhere near close to what your body needs. So highly recommend that you buy it. If you're going to take it as a supplement, you use a concentrated version of it. Let's see here. So Melissa's asking, do you heal the gut to heal leaky brain? Yes, in a sense you can, but again, you can have a leaky brain without having a leaky gut. So for some people, it's not an issue of the gut being damaged. And no more classic of an example that we see this, in my experience, than with a mold issue. So a mold issue is one of the big reasons why we might see a persistent or a leaky brain type scenario without a leaky gut, is a mold issue, and that's mold externally in the environment. So maybe you've got mold growing in your air ducts or under your carpet. I've seen people where we found mold under their bed. We found mold in windowsills. We found mold in their air register. We found mold in the bathroom, in the ventilation fan. So it can be found, and it can be one of those types of problems. It can be major issue, especially for people who are mold sensitive. Now, interestingly enough, many people with grain sensitivity or gluten sensitivity, the genes for mold susceptibility are similar, meaning that these genes are called HLA-DQ alpha and HLA-DQ beta 1 genes. And many of the same patterns that are mold susceptible patterns are also gluten sensitive patterns. So that a lot of people with gluten sensitivity do have a mold issue as well, or a mold susceptibility issue, meaning if they're in a moldy environment, they're the ones that tend to get sicker when other people around them can be in the same moldy environment and not really suffer so much. Tara's asking a follow-up question. Let's go ahead and answer it. Mold seems to be in almost all environments. How do you know if it's negatively affecting you or if it's part of the problem? A couple different ways, Tara. If you suspect mold, the first thing to do, I would recommend a visual inspection of the home. You want to go through your home and make sure there's no obvious sources of mold. And places to look to start would be anywhere there's ever been a leak, a pipe busted, or a roof leak, or a drip pan leak, potentially your water heater in your attic. Sometimes we'll see water dripping from a roof leak into the insulation. It'll turn the pink or yellow insulation brown. You'll sometimes see black or brown growing around air registers. If it's not just dirt or dust, that's oftentimes a sign of mold. You can sometimes see it in the grout of the bathroom. So a lot of ways that you can look, just visibly check for mold. The key one is if your house smells musty, there's mold in it, and it's potentially a very big problem if you smell must. Other ways to know, so like we're talking about biochemical testing. What are some of the ways that you can know whether mold is a problem? One of the best ways to know is to do solid immune testing for mold allergy. That's step one that can be done. And if you have a positive result for mold toxicity or for mold reaction, now we can start asking the question, is the environment in the home moldy? And there are certain types of tests that can be done. One of my favorite tests for mold toxicity inside a home is something called an ERMI, Environmental Relativity Mold Index test. And it's a dust collection sample kit that you can do on your home. And it helps to measure different types of spores and mold spore counts and quantifies them. And it can be very, very valuable tool in trying to ascertain whether or not mold is part of your environment. Another thing that can be done is you can do mycotoxin testing, where you actually measure whether or not you have inside your body mold toxins. These are not the same thing as mold. These are mold toxins are produced by mold, but they're not mold. So some people don't have a mold allergy, but they are reacting to mold toxins. As a matter of fact, a lot of our food, a lot of our grains, one of the reasons they can be so unhealthy for people is that grains commonly harbor mold toxins, especially like corn and wheat. These are notorious for holding on to mold toxins because of the way that they grow. Let's see if I can put some research up on the screen for you to read more about some of this information, because I think it's super important that, again, that you go on. I'm going to post an article up here for you on corn and mold toxins. It's actually one of the most common sources of mold toxins, and as a matter of fact, it's pretty prevalent in the U.S. It's a major farming issue. A lot of times crops can't be used if the levels of mycotoxin in them are too high. Let's see here. I'm also going to put up an article on. We did a story with Fox News a couple of years ago on mold toxicity, and let's see. I'm going to put that link up so you can learn a little bit more there as well. But mold is one of those, if you've got an issue in the home, you never want to take it lightly. It can be highly, highly volatilely dangerous. I've actually seen people die from refusing to get out of moldy environments. And again, it can be one of those big causes of brain inflammation. I've seen mold be that missing link for many people, where they've already gone grain free. They've turned their diet around. They've done everything that from a diet perspective that can be done, and mold can be that missing link, especially if you're living in a high humid environment like where I live in Houston and along the Gulf Coast. So where we see a lot of people struggling in Houston and Louisiana, Baton Rouge and New Orleans. We'll see people struggling along the Gulf Coast in Alabama, Mississippi, and even Florida with mold issues. And once mold gets in the home, if it's hidden and you can't see it, I've seen cases where we discovered 2-inch thick carpets of mold growing behind somebody's wall. It wasn't growing where you could see it. It was growing, behind the wall. And that sometimes is the case with mold. So you just have to, if you suspect that, you definitely want to do your diligence and try to figure out whether it's there. Susan's asking, what are good ways to strengthen the vagus nerve? Vagus tonicity, one of the best ways to strengthen the vagus nerve is meditative breathing. So deep breathing exercises. The vagus nerve itself is a cranial nerve. It's actually cranial nerve 10. And it sets a lot of our parasympathetic tone. So it helps with digestion. It helps with calming, relaxation. It helps with sleep. So if you think about how do we exercise the vagus nerve, reprime it, one of the best things you can do is minimize external stressors that you have control to minimize. So for example, if you hang out with a person every day that just ramps you up with anxiety, you might consider that relationship, and you might consider stepping back away from that relationship for a time to really get a grip on understimulating the vagus, because Again, if your vagus is understimulated, it'll affect your digestion and it'll affect your sleep. Predominantly can affect your oxygen too, because it helps to control breathing. So deep breathing, meditative type breathing is one of the best exercises you can do to help stimulate healthy vagus nerve function. Exercise in general is also a great thing that you should be doing, especially high intensity interval, to your ability to tolerate it. All righty, let's see here. Can you take DHA if you're iron allergic? Absolutely. DHA and iron have nothing to do with each other. And by the way, Barbara, you cannot be iron allergic. Iron is an essential metal, meaning your body can't function without it. So you can't be allergic to iron per se. Now, you can be allergic to some things that have iron in them. For example, some people don't do well with too much iron if they have a liver problem, but that's not the same thing as being allergic to iron. You know, the liver, if the liver's taking on damage, sometimes too much iron can create problems. Or if you have an iron toxicity, that can be a problem. But again, it's not the same thing as an iron allergy. There's no such thing as an iron allergy. And I want to be clear on that, because iron's an essential nutrient that the body cannot survive without. And so there's sometimes people think, oh, I'm allergic to iodine or I'm allergic to iron. You can't be allergic to them. You can have a toxicity that causes you to have symptoms when you take them. And again, just for clarity, I want to be clear that you understand that it's not an allergy. Okay, let's see here. Chuck's Ogala is chiming in. Hi, nice to see you on the show tonight. Christy's asking, is standard process a problem if it's not gluten-free? I was told the amount of gluten or allergen foods would not affect a person become of, I'm not quite sure I can read this and understand it, not affect a person become of the measurements of them in each product. Well, I'm going to answer this question in the way I think that what you mean, and that is simply this. Standard Process is a supplement company, and a lot of their products contain wheat germ. And if you're gluten sensitive and you're taking those products, you're getting cross-contamination, and it doesn't matter what anyone tries to tell you. I've heard, people come to see me from all over the world, and one of the things I've heard time and time again is my other doctor told me these products were just fine because they're good quality. Even though I'm gluten sensitive and I have a problem with wheat, they still tell me these products are fine. No, they're not. Standard Process is not an okay product if you have a gluten sensitivity or a wheat allergy, if the product that you're buying from them contains that ingredient. So again, it boils back down to read the ingredients and make sure you know what you're taking, and make sure you know what is gluten and what is not gluten. Okay. Mary from Kermit, West Virginia chiming in. Good evening, Mary. Let's see here. We had mold air testing because I was sick and they could see what was in it. So not quite, I don't see the question there. Mold air, I will say this about mold air testing. It can be very inaccurate. And one of the reasons why is they do a comparative test. So they do a mold test and they use the outdoor air as the control. So if you live in a humid climate and it's a high moldy day, your control might be elevated, which will minimize the quantity or the relationship between the outdoor air and the indoor air, and it can give you a kind of a misleading result. It's one of the reasons why I don't like air testing. I'm not saying it can't be effective at finding mold. It's expensive and it's not always very accurate. So I wouldn't solely rely on air testing to ascertain whether or not mold is an issue. So, man, I'm glad you're chiming in on this, Christy. We found mold in the entire AC system of our home and had it cleaned. Less than 2 years later, returned. Entire system was replaced. Yeah, that's part of what can happen. My advice is if you've got it in your AC system, don't clean the AC system. Replace the ductwork and replace the unit, because the likelihood that it'll just return if you just clean it out. Mold is a very, very industrious microorganism. It survives. It's very good at surviving. So a cleanse or a clean won't necessarily do the job. So highly recommend a replacement. One of the best ways to filter for mold in the home is using something called ultra fine HEPA. And if it's not ultra fine, then it's not fine enough. In other words, a standard HEPA filter will pull mold spores, but it will not pull mycotoxins. And you really want something that can filter out mycotoxins. Again, that's, my advice. Don't, you definitely don't want to play around. If you suspect mold, you definitely don't want to play around with it. It's one of the most dangerous things that I see when people are struggling with their health. So Charlene's asking, could you have chronic bad breath with mold in your sinus? How do you get rid of this? Yes, it's possible. It's a theory that it's possible until and I've seen this be the case where people had chronic sinusitis and really bad breath because they had mold growing inside of them. And those mycotoxins and mold toxins and outgassing was showing up as bad breath. So the way you get rid of it is, depending on how you identified it. I mean, I'm a big fan of doing a culture because I want to do a culture because I want to know what it is. Is it mold, or do we suspect it's mold, or is it bacteria, or is it something else? And once you have an identification, then you can do what's called a sensitivity, meaning you can discern what will be best at killing it for you. Now, if you're looking for home remedies, there are a number of different home remedies that have been shown to have effectiveness against both molds or fungus as well as bacteria. Tea tree oil, oregano oil, thyme, lavender oil is another one. So there are a number of really great oils that you can also use. And one of the things you can do is you can put oils into a neti pot, and you can do sinus drainage rinses several times a day. And that for some people is very, very effective. I've had people that they were identified or isolated with a bacteria in the nose, and they didn't want to go an antibiotic route, so they decided to go a natural oil route with a neti pot, and that for some people that can be a very effective and natural way to go. So yes, to answer your question. Next question: can a 2-year-old be tested for mycotoxins? Yes, anyone at any age can be tested for mycotoxins. How do I feel about maltodextrin in supplements? Is that really gluten? Thanks for doing these live events. Well, thank you for saying thank you, Christine. Yes, I believe maltodextrin is a problem most of the time. Now, that being said, let's talk about maltodextrin. There's 3 predominant ways that we produce maltodextrin in a supplement. Some of them are wheat derived, some of them are corn derived, and some of them are potato derived. And I've seen tapioca maltodextrin as well, becoming more popular now with the grain-free diets. So if you don't have a differentiation on the food label, and that's in essence, if it just says maltodextrin, it's either probably wheat or probably corn. And if you're in the US, it's probably corn. So if they don't clarify on the label, don't use it. That would be my advice. Let's see. So I want to mention this because Rachel's talking about how she has vagus nerve dysfunction that affects her heart and stomach and causes gastroparesis, which is a lockdown of peristaltic motion within the GI tract. So the food won't digest. It just sits in the stomach or colon and rots. And that can be a major issue. Again, going back to how do we stimulate restoration of vagus nerve function? Look, one of the best things that you can do is go see your chiropractor. If you don't have one, you should. A lot of times the missing link with neurological tonicity and improving neurological function is, opening up nerve flow through your spine. And chiropractors, nobody's trained better in the world to be able to do that than your chiropractor. So that may be a missing piece. If you haven't experienced a chiropractic adjustment, that might be something that's extremely helpful for your vagus nerve dysfunction. The big thing is getting rid of poison relationships. I see people all the time, and they struggle and they struggle and they struggle and they struggle, and their diet is clean and their lifestyle is clean and they're exercising and they're doing everything right, but they have toxic relationships. And I'm not saying that that's your case, Rachel, but if it is, then you have to really, really look at those relationships hard and evaluate them. And you have to ask yourself the question, is that relationship worth my health? Is it worth my life? And in some cases, you have to make a tough decision. Dana's asking, I was told gluten diet was a must for me having systemic scleroderma. Do I agree? Look, I don't like to make Well, here I am making all these broad generalizations tonight, Dana. But no, in honesty, scleroderma is an autoimmune condition. And I've seen a number of these types of things in my clinic, in my office, with dealing with chronically sick autoimmune patients for years. And I've not yet seen a case of scleroderma where gluten sensitivity was not playing a contributing role or factor. So I can answer that question based on my experience, which is every case of scleroderma I've ever seen within my office in the last 17 years, gluten played a role, and a very, very significant one. So based on that, I would say, yeah, you could probably benefit from going on a gluten-free diet. That being said, I also am very, very well known for my objectivity in things, meaning I'm a big believer in testing as much as possible where we can eliminate the need for guessing. And that includes a gluten-free diet. Too many people try to go gluten-free, or they're told to go gluten-free, but they don't know whether or not going gluten-free is the right thing for them to do because they were never accurately tested. So, one of the things that I would recommend, Dana, is to get accurately tested. And the only way you can really do that effectively and accurately is through genetics. So I'm going to put you a link up here. And, if it's something that you really, you really want to dive into deeper and know more specifically for yourself, I just posted that link for you so you can chase it down and you can read more about it and learn more about genetic testing for gluten sensitivity. Okay, let's see here. Oh, Marianne is chiming in. Hey, Doc, you helped me with a gluten ataxia back in 2011. I do think my vertigo issues are diet related. Vagus nerve gets affected. Yeah, I mean, I put that up there. Thank you for chiming in, Marianne, because so many people hearing your story and your response will take it more seriously and might do the right thing by changing their diet. Let's see. So several of you asking me about what I think about certain brands of supplements. I generally don't like to comment on other brands simply because it's not fair. It's not fair for me to represent another brand when they're not here to counter or provide a counter argument. Look, the reality is in a clinic scenario, when I'm working one-on-one with a person, I don't use over-the-counter products. And there's a lot of reasons why I don't use over-the-counter, because they're not pharmaceutical grade. And when I'm dealing with somebody with chronic illness, I want to make sure that what we're using is guaranteed to be what we think it is. And that way, if a person doesn't get better, if a person's levels don't come up, we at least know that it wasn't because what we were using was the wrong product. So when it comes to other people's products, that's kind of the viewpoint I take. I don't use other people's products because I can't verify how they were produced, how they were manufactured, whether they were manufactured in a clean room that's been scrubbed. And if you don't know what that means, it's because maybe you've never been in a manufacturing facility. But I have a lot of experience in this area because I've been formulating products for 15 years. And part of when I formulate a product is I tour the manufacturing facilities and look at the way they clean their rooms and scrub their rooms and look at their systems and look at the different things that go on behind the scenes that a lot of people don't realize or think about as it relates to the production of nutraceuticals or of vitamin and mineral supplements. So I don't like to talk bad about anyone's product, but I also, I know that when it comes to correcting illness and when it comes to supporting somebody's health, you got to take what is high quality. And, from that perspective, again, that may not help you. I never recommend buying supplements off of Amazon. There's a lot of knockoff brands on Amazon, meaning a lot of people sell fake product. Even if the label's identical, there are knockoffs. And there was a big news report on this a couple of years ago, and Amazon can't police it all. There's so many companies out there, it's impossible for them to police it. The FDA can't police it. So I don't recommend, here's the general rule. If it's cheaper, if it's a super cheap product, then you're probably getting what you're paying for. That's the general rule with supplements, because the ingredients that are actually effective cost money. And from somebody who produces his own line, I produce a number of different products, I can tell you that high quality ingredients cost more. If you're seeing something and it's too cheap, it's too good to be true, it probably is. A lot of manufacturers are dishonest. We have seen cases where manufacturers were cutting CoQ10 products with riboflavin because it's a lot cheaper. We've seen cases where products were contaminated with lead. We've seen cases where products that were supposed to be super high level nootropics being actually just B vitamins, which are a lot cheaper. And so again, it's, you know, just because it says it on the label doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Again, there's fraud out there, and I just, you know, to protect yourself, I recommend you go with a reputable, a highly reputable company. I just happen to believe that my company is one of the most highly reputable if you're looking for a grain-free product that's been rigorously tested and scrutinized. And that's kind of where I'll leave that question. Let's see here. Question, is it reasonable to believe that radiators are a healthier heat source compared to forced air? No, it's not really. If you're shopping for a new house and you're looking at kind of what kind of system to put in, look, my advice is put in ultra HEPA filtration. It's a great company who does this for a reasonable fee, and it's a whole house system called IQ Air. It's one I would recommend if you're especially if you're looking at moving into a new home. Lack of ducts don't necessarily reduce the risk of mold, because it's not ducts that create the mold. I mean, a duct is a dark environment, and if you get a leak or if you get water coming into a duct, yeah, it can create it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. Let's see here. So tapioca maltodextrin is okay, or it just depends on the person? Both. You know, look, I'm not a huge fan of any type of maltodextrin. There are certain cases where it's used for certain very specific reasons, but if you're buying product every day and using a lot of product that contains a lot of maltodextrin, no matter the source, remember what maltodextrin is. It's the sugar refinement of a product. So it's basically you're extrapolating out a lot of the sugar component. And sugar's not good for people. When you take sugar and you concentrate it, doesn't matter what you choose to call it, whether you call it glucose or treacle or invert sugar, or if you want to call it organic sucanat or organic cane sugar, whether you call it maltodextrin, it's still sugar. And so it's just something that I don't recommend in mass for anyone. Hi, Pamela. Good to hear from you. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Let's see here. So, okay, Natalie's asking about a question about supplements. If I'm correct, supplements have to go through the liver before they go into our bloodstream or body. How do you know it is not an overload? There are a number of different tests that can help us identify whether the liver's in duress. Yeah, so when supplements get into your bloodstream, before they get into the central circulation, they have to go through the portal circulation. So that's part of the liver component. You know, if you've got a damaged liver, and there are a lot of physical exam findings that can show us whether or not a liver is damaged. There are lab tests like ALT and AST and ALP, which can show us liver damage biochemically. But then there are also other physical signs and symptoms like yellowing of the skin or yellowing of the eyes, something called a splinter hemorrhage in the nail bed, which is looks like a little black splinter in your nails. That can be an early warning sign of liver damage. So, you know, those are all things. But the general rule of thumb here, Natalie, is that, you know, supplements don't kill people. I mean, the amount of reported deaths from supplement overdose is virtually zero versus the amount of, well, let's just take aspirin as an example. The amount of deaths from aspirin last year reached about 15,000 people. So, you know, supplements are not really necessarily going to create a whole big, huge problem for a person's liver. So I'm a lot less worried about a supplement creating a liver problem, unless, again, it's a poor quality product that has some potential type of contamination. Now that could be a risk, or that could be an issue. But if you're taking a high quality supplement product, the risk of it doing damage to the liver is probably relatively non-existent. Okay, this is a great question. I'm going to take a minute to answer. Christine, we've had mold issues in our attic. My husband cleaned it up and put a mold test kit up there. It came back fine. Depending on the type of mold test kit, if it was an air collection kit, don't trust it. You got to do an ERMI test. There's black on the plywood. We're going to be getting it replaced. I just ran a Cyrex Array 14 and aflatoxin was in normal range. Does that mean I'm clear and not being harmed by the mold? No, that doesn't mean that at all, because Cyrex Array measuring aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is, generally speaking, it's a type of mold toxin, not a mold at all. It's a mold toxin, and it's generally found in food, not in black mold. If you've got black mold in your attic, now we're talking about different kinds of mold toxins like trichothecene, or we're talking about things like ochratoxin, or we're talking about gliotoxin as a potential possibility. These are different types of mold toxins. So a Cyrex Array 14 doesn't pick up on that. A Cyrex Array 14 doesn't pick up on whether or not you even have a mycotoxin issue. It just picks up as to whether or not you're having an immune response, an IgG or IgA related immune response to mycotoxin, aflatoxin, but it doesn't tell you whether or not that aflatoxin is actually damaging you. And it's not the same thing. Being allergic to something and being damaged by something that's a poison are completely two separate things. A person can be allergic to something and get damaged by it, but if you take in a poison in high enough quantities, you're going to get damaged by it whether you're allergic to it or not. And remember, the Cyrex is an allergy test. It's not a test to measure whether or not you have mold toxicity. Good question. Glad you asked it. If you've been diagnosed with Meniere's, can that also be a gluten issue? Yes, Meniere's, which is an inner ear disease, it's a neurological disease of the inner ear, causes dizziness. Yes, gluten has been shown to cause and contribute to the development of Meniere's. Okay, next question. What impact of electromagnetic frequencies we have all around us with having Lyme or mold exposure? Look, EMFs can be a problem, and some people are really super sensitive or ultra sensitive to electromagnetic fields. And that is, generally in my experience, the ones that are most sensitive to EMFs are chronically ill for other reasons, and the EMFs are now just one more pile up on other things. So, for example, a person with mold exposure, a person with an infection, a person with a gluten allergy starts to become more and more sensitive to EMFs because their immune system becomes so overwhelmed, and now it's just EMF is just one more thing. One more thing to deal with. So EMFs are something I would recommend if you have a smart house that you shut it down. I don't recommend a smart house. If you're looking at building, I don't recommend smart houses. I don't recommend using your Bluetooth to any aggressive degree. I don't recommend, if you've got, a wireless internet connection at home, I recommend, going hardwire if you have that. It's the best option. And at night, if you don't go hardwire, I recommend turning off all of your routers at night so that you're not running that field through your home. One of the problems we have in modern society is, even if you do all those things to protect you at your own home, you still go to work, you still get in your car every day, you still drive around the city, you're still exposed to everyone else's EMFs. It's one of those really, really challenging things to control. Commercial shampoos and brain health. Depends on the commercial shampoo. There's some pretty good brands out there. But some of the shampoos, look, the volatile organic compounds and the different fragrances and aromas that many of them use are highly toxic and caustic, and you're breathing them straight into your brain through your nose. Remember, your olfactory nerve in your nose is part of your brain. So that, I would just recommend buying a non-toxic version of shampoo. Nat, hi, Doc. Cefaxin 550 milligrams to heal SIBO. SIBO stands for, those of you listening, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. My doc says the stomach will be healed in 10 days. What are your thoughts on such magical pill? Look, first of all, I don't want to say anything bad about your doc, Nat. But any doctor who guesses to predict the future that says you can be healed in 10 days, for me, that's a leery thing. understand as a doctor, we don't guarantee an outcome. We can't predict the future because we don't know everything. We know as much as we know. You know, the old saying goes, you don't know what you don't know. You know, and there are a lot of unknowns in what you just mentioned. And one of them is, how do you know you have SIBO? Did they do hydrogen methane gas breath testing to document and verify whether or not that was the case? Or are you just bloated a lot and so they're guessing that you have SIBO? You know, that to me, and I don't know your history, and nor am I trying to create a doctor-patient relationship in this Facebook. But again, you know, anytime I hear somebody say, yeah, do this and you'll be healed, that, you know, you've got to take that with a weight of salt, and ask a bigger question. One, the bigger question I would ask is, do you actually have SIBO? Two, the next question I would ask is, if you're going to go on an antibiotic, is that antibiotic going to have a side effect that could potentially damage you in other ways and set you up for loss or failure in some other way? Like, you know, commonly with chronic illness and SIBO, people that take antibiotics can oftentimes be pre-exposed or predisposed to developing a yeast overgrowth, which can create just as many problems, if not more, in the GI tract as a SIBO problem. So again, it depends. You know, I don't. There's no such thing as a magic pill. I mean, don't get me wrong. Antibiotics can be a very, very effective form of treatment, and they've saved, you know, countless lives in the last, you know, since they were brought on in the late 1920s. They've saved a lot of lives, but we have this tendency to overprescribe and overuse them in today's world, and that's where I would just be leery. I'd just be leery of any kind of magical predictions. And I would just have an intelligent conversation with that doctor about the risks of being on that antibiotic versus the benefit, and talk about whether or not you were actually tested for SIBO before guessing SIBO. And again, I don't know if that's the case or not, because, you know, I don't have that information. Let's see here. Shauna, I don't know what you mean, Shauna. Hypo, best foods or foods to stay away from? Hypo what? Hypothyroid, hypoadrenal function, hypogastro function. I don't know what that means, but I'm just gonna assume, Shauna, that you're talking about the thyroid. And if you're talking about a thyroid, an autoimmune thyroid problem, the best list of foods I can give you is No Grain, No Pain. Go get a copy, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, comprehensive list of what to stay away from and what is safe to eat. Oh, I like this one. Solaris chiming in. Thank you, Solaris, for the compliment. What about colloidal silver for overall virus or infection, which includes possible sinus issues? Look, I love silver as a tool for sinus problems. Like a homeopathic colloidal silver can be an excellent home remedy for somebody who's struggling with persistent sinus issues. So I like it. It's a great tool. It doesn't work in 100% of people, but it can be a very effective tool for many. Sherry's asking, can chronic stress or anxiety cause leaky brain? Yeah, it absolutely can. Look, stress is one of the great destroyers of human health. And, the body can manifest stress in 3 different ways. We have physical, chemical, and we have emotional stresses. And some people have traumatic, life-changing events. For example, I've seen people get extremely sick after a severe relationship breakup, or after I've seen parents get sick over losing a child. God forbid that ever happens to anyone. I've seen people get extremely sick over divorces. So again, there are emotional states of stress that can be so great that can contribute to illness. There are physical states of stress, meaning you don't sleep enough, you physically overtax your body, you work out too much. I see this oftentimes in athletes who do overtraining. They can get sick as a result. And then there's chemical stressors, and those are environmental chemicals like heavy metals, or environmental chemicals like pollutants or EMFs, environmental chemicals that are in the food like pesticides. It could be the food itself, food allergies and other things that create chemical stress. And it could be lack of nutrition, lack of quality nutrition, leading to an inability to tolerate stresses effectively. So yes, to answer your question, stress can definitely create this process and this problem. So if you're chronically stressed, you're overstressed, right, and you've done your diet right, everything else is dialed in, now you have to start really asking yourself where that chronic stress is coming from, and how can you cope or deal with it in a more effective manner. And this sometimes too is one of the big missing pieces of the leaky brain puzzle. Is somebody's just in a chronically stressful environment, and they stay in that environment and they don't leave it, and they go back to it repetitively over and over and over again, and they struggle to get better. I've seen this with people who hate their job. If somebody goes to work every day for 8 hours, in a cubicle, and they feel like that the work that they're doing is not part of their passion, it's not part of what their heart wants them to follow, and the work they're doing is soul crushing every day. If you crush your soul for 8 hours a day, every day, Monday through Friday, that's a huge stress. That can be a big, big factor in a person's recovery. So, again, that, definitely can create that problem. Good question. Sylvia is asking about a product looked like you ordered online. Look, don't ask me, because I have a team that's there to help you with that. If you just email Sylvia, if you'll email glutenology@gmail.com and let them know, just copy and paste that note you put in, let them know. They'll take great care of you and find out what's going on for you. We want to make sure you get that delivered to you. Okay. Question, are there different types of probiotics for different people to clear up a person's gut? Yeah, there are. And a lot of that, Kayla, depends on a person's bacterial flora. In essence, part of the reason why I personally like to measure it is so that I know what to deliver, what is best to give, what concentration, what dose, what different species that are going to be best for the person's individual situation. Oh man, this is a tough one, Jamie. Natural ways to clear Marcons. For those of you who don't know, Marcons is multiple antibiotic resistant coagulase negative staph. Yeah, there are. Probably in my experience, some of the best and most effective ways for people to do it on their own naturally is a combination of silver and EDTA. And there are a few compounding pharmacies in the US that produce a nasal spray for that. I would get with your doctor and talk about that as an option if you've been diagnosed with Marcons and you're trying to get that clear. But yes, silver and EDTA can be one of the most effective natural ways. But Marcons is just a bear. It's very, very, very tough. It's very, very hard to kill, especially in an immunosuppressed individual. The issue with Marcons is usually Marcons is accompanied with a high mold environment. So if you're in a high mold environment, you'll never beat Marcons as long as you're in the moldy environment. So the first step is you've got to isolate and identify whether or not your environment is moldy. And second of all, if it is, get out of it. Because if you're going to attempt to go after Marcons and you stay in the mold, you'll never win that war. I've never seen it happen. It's just a tough thing to deal with. Clients of mine are asking about the new hit of a high fat burning supplement consisting of turmeric and forskolin. I'm not a fan of these hits, but cannot find anything against it. Look, anybody who's taking a pill to lose weight, I'm going to just say it like it is. They're a moron. Pills do not generate weight loss. Consistent behavioral change over time does. So if your goal is to lose weight, there's not a magic pill that's going to create that solution. It just doesn't exist. Now, what does turmeric do? Turmeric's an anti-inflammatory. And so if you have hypercortisol excretion because you're chronically inflamed, turmeric can reduce that inflammatory response, but it doesn't solve why the inflammation is there. So using a pill for weight loss is to me is as foolish as using a pill to try to treat something when you haven't changed your diet and lifestyle. And I say that because, people who take all these fad weight loss products and they're out there spending hundreds of dollars, for the next big newest secret thing that was discovered in the South African jungle or wherever the next, magical thing comes from. Look, they're really weight change. You've got to be willing to put in the work to make it happen. And if you're not willing, there's no pill on earth that's going to create that. It's going to do that work for you. So I'll get off my horse now, but good question. I hear the frustration in that question for you. Last question before I wrap it up. How do you test for mark-ons? Very simply, you do a nasal culture, nasal swab. And it has to be, the culture has to go deep enough into the deep sinuses to be accurate. So, you know, some people just will do a nasal swab, and you can do that too. But if you sometimes mark-ons gets in deep, it gets up into the upper sinus. So you've really got to take that swab back deep into the sinus to really, you know, for it to be an effective diagnostic benefit. So again, you do a nasal swab, and you know, you've got to make sure the swab is long enough and gets back into the deep sinus. Okay, so we're gonna wrap the show. Before I do, a couple of quick things. Number one, if you don't, you want to go make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get all of these in our massive library of educational videos. Look, at the big bottom line is I want you to learn, and I want you to be able to get this information and watch it at your leisure. So if you haven't already, you go to youtube.com/glutenology and make sure you're subscribing there. I'm also going to put that link up for you. The other thing, if you haven't, and those of you who are new to the show, maybe didn't chime in tonight, maybe nervous because you're new and just didn't feel comfortable asking questions yet. Make sure you get a copy of No Grain, No Pain. If you don't already have that, it's it's $10 that might literally save your life, and I don't say that lightly. I say that very seriously. Two, make sure you go to glutenfreesociety.org, glutenfreesociety.org, and sign up. We have, if you're new to all this, one of the things that I have as a free gift to help educate you is a gluten-free survival kit. So if you go to glutenfreesociety.org and sign up for the newsletter there, you can get a free series with a gluten-free survival kit, and that will help you start navigating the muddy waters of diet, especially if you struggle with chronic autoimmune problems. It'll really help you navigate those waters. So again, make sure you subscribe, and make sure too, do me a favor, make sure you share this feed. If you know somebody that can benefit from this information, don't be stingy with it. Look, let's have an abundance type of mindset where the more people we help, the more we share this information, the more grassroots it becomes, the bigger it grows, the easier it is for all of us to find healthy alternatives, the easier it is for us to shop in our grocery stores without having to worry about buying chemicals, the easier for all of us to raise our children in a sane social environment where people don't look at us like we have 10 horns growing out of our head when we say we're not going to eat that junk food that you're feeding your own kids. So, again, share the message, share the love, and let's get the world understanding and preaching. So have a great evening. We'll see you next week for Pig Dr. Osborne's Brain. Have a fantastic week. Take care.